Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending our round one of final presentations for our Great Lakes Summer Fellows program. And before I let the fellows really take over, I want to especially thank them for choosing to spend their summer with us. I know people have lots of options of how to spend their summer while they're in school, and we are so grateful that you chose to come here. This is something that everyone really looks forward to, and it really is one of the highlights of the summer here. So thank you. And also thanks to all of your mentors for all their dedication and energy that they've put into making this a great experience for all of you. So today we have our first round. We have 7 of the fellows presenting, including one that is from University of Illinois, Mary Grace. So she is with us on webinar, and when she presents, we'll be turning it over to her for her remote presentation. And thank you too to everybody that's attending via webinar. We have some friends and family of our fellows, which is really exciting. And if any of you on webinar, when we get to the question period, have questions, you can type them in and we will read them aloud in the room. So with that, I will turn it on over to Rae Fadlovich, who will give our first presentation. Thanks.
Hi, so I'm Rae, and I'm going to be talking about the Lake Erie Atlantis model. It's not working. It's not going here either. Okay, so just a little bit about me. I'm going to be a senior at Arizona State University, and I'm really interested in aquatic invasive species. I'll be completing an undergraduate thesis on the prevalence of a pathogenic fungus in amphibians sold in pet stores. And in the future, I plan on going to graduate school. So an outline of my project: first, we're going to talk about the big question, then go into an overview of the model that I used, the focus of my project, the main roadblocks I encountered, and then the calibration that I was able to do. And we're going to wrap up with the future direction of the Lake Erie Atlantis model. So the big question is really, how can we model the impact of different anthropogenic stressors, such as nutrient loading and fisheries catch? And is there a model that can help us evaluate different remediation actions, such as how decreased nutrient loading can affect the entire Lake Erie system? We also want to be able to model the impact of invasive species, such as the Asian carp. And although other models exist that show us what an Asian carp invasion might do in Lake Erie, the Atlantis model provides some advantages that can show us an improved idea of how Asian carp would really take hold in Lake Erie. So a quick overview of why we chose to use the Atlantis model. It's a spatially explicit ecosystem model, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, but it really considers the entire system of the lake that you're using. And it starts with the oceanographic data. So it reads in the flows throughout your lake, and then it can calculate the different movement of water, which is really helpful for getting the basis of different nutrient flows in your system. Then Atlantis calculates the biogeochemistry of the system. You input initial nutrient values, and Atlantis will circulate them through the model and keep them at appropriate levels. Atlantis also calculates the entire ecosystem food web, and you input different parameters such as dietary preferences, habitat cover, etc. And Atlantis will calculate where different organisms are at every single time step, who's getting eaten and who's dying. Then there's a fisheries sub model, which is really helpful for evaluating fisheries catch. And this sub model reads in different fisheries catch scenarios and can tell you how they'll actually impact the Lake Erie system. So for a model to be able to do all of these things, it's going to be very complex, and this leads to some of the downsides of Atlantis. The main one is that it's very labor intensive, and you have to input all of these parameters to tell Atlantis how the ecosystem interacts with itself. The other big disadvantage of the Atlantis ecosystem model is that it was developed for an ocean ecosystem, meaning that it uses nitrogen as the common currency. Every organism within the Atlantis model is modeled as their concentration of nitrogen. This works really well for an ocean ecosystem model where nitrogen is currently or is commonly the limiting nutrient, but in Lake Erie and a lot of lakes, we see that phosphorus can limit growth, and it's really hard for Atlantis to cooperate with a phosphorus growth limitation. So here's our specific Lake Erie Atlantis model. There have been 4 other fellows who have worked on this project, and they've really helped to get all of that legwork, all of that data that we need to get the model to run. Here you'll see the box geometry of the Lake Erie Atlantis model. We have 39 different boxes, and each box has anywhere from 2 to 9 layers, depending on the water depth. And this really helps Atlantis be spatially explicit in each one of these different box and layer combinations. It calculates all of those things I talked about for the Atlantis model independently, and then it connects them with those hydrodynamic flows. The other fellows have also collected all of the inputs that are needed to initialize the model, all the nutrient data for Lake Erie, and as well that fisheries catch data. That brings us to my project, which is to calibrate the Atlantis model to put together all of these pieces and hopefully make the Lake Erie Atlantis model represent the actual system. Because this is a really big task, I have been focusing on calibrating the primary producers in the Western Basin, and this is where we see the microcystis blooms in Lake Erie. So if we can properly model that big influx of primary productivity in the summer, it will be a lot easier for us to model the rest of the food chain that responds to these big blooms in the summer. However, because Atlantis is so big and so expansive, there were a lot of unexpected roadblocks while I was doing my calibration, and this led to a lot of collaboration with different scientists because Atlantis requires a lot of specialized inputs and specialized knowledge. So as I mentioned, my focus was on these primary producers, and here you can see the formula for how Atlantis calculates primary producer growth. First, Atlantis considers the light that's available in the box layer combination, and if there's not enough light available for photosynthesis, the primary producers will not grow. Next, Atlantis considers the temperature of the water and scales the growth rate depending on if it's colder or warmer. Atlantis also accounts for the space available, and if organisms get too crowded, they'll die off. Primary producers can be grazed upon by different organisms such as zooplankton, and when this happens, their nutrient concentration can then pass up through the Lake Erie food web. Primary producers can also die, and when they die, they leave that primary producer biomass pool, and they can go to the detrital pool. When these nutrients then sit in the detrital pool, they can be broken down by bacteria that then release those nutrients. The cell death can also immediately lead to available nutrients, and these available nutrients are what fuel that primary producer growth in the system. So as you can see, there's really a lot of components that go into just calculating this primary producer growth, and that's part of the reason it's so complex to just even initialize the base layer of the food web. So now I'm going to talk about the main roadblocks I encountered when trying to calibrate Atlantis. The first of which was that I had certain cells where we were trying to force in nutrient loads to represent the different river inputs to Lake Erie, but it was blocking out the light within those cells. Then I encountered a problem where in those boxes we realized that the forced nutrients were just building and building and they weren't actually going anywhere. We also saw that the phosphorus in our system wasn't getting recycled. And finally, we had an issue with the actual location of our Lake Erie Atlantis map. So the first problem, without having any light in the cell, as I mentioned, you can't have primary producer growth. We noticed that in this box 2, where our Detroit River forces in, we had less than 5 watts per square meter of light reaching the surface layer cell. What happened was the dissolved organic nitrogen from that river input was just building and building in that cell, and Lake Erie Atlantis model calculates the light attenuation through the water based on a number of factors, one of which is the dissolved organic nitrogen. So the more DON you have in your system, the less light will pass through. Unfortunately, ours was almost completely blocking out the light, so nothing could grow. We hypothesized that this was because we didn't have an accurate Lake Erie hydrodynamic model running in our Atlantis model, so we decided to use one that would accurately depict the flows of Lake Erie, where 96% of the water comes into this box from the Detroit River and then basically flows eastward. So we got an updated hydrodynamic file by taking it from the FVCOM model and overlaying the box geometry of our Atlantis model to the FVCOM outputs and translating those FVCOM outputs to the box-to-box flows that Atlantis can read. When we did this, unfortunately, we still saw that there was a lot of nutrient buildup in these problem cells, although it was greatly improved. So here we can see the first box in my Atlantis model, which is where the Maumee River flows in. And when we initialized our model, we initialized it with the values expected for 1999, the initialized year, and we had around 740 milligrams per cubic meter of nitrate. Unfortunately, after just 10 years of model run, we were up to 9,000 milligrams per cubic meter, and this made it almost impossible to calibrate the primary producer growth because you ask the primary producers to respond to the nutrient levels, and if the nutrient levels are wildly high, your primary producers just want to grow wildly high. Unfortunately, we can't just take out this nutrient forcing because this nutrient forcing is really important to modeling the ecosystem of the western basin of Lake Erie. So we decided to add the water that would also be being forced in with these nutrients from the river in the real live system. So when we forced in this water along with the nutrients, we still had the same initial start value, but then after 10 years in this same Maumee River box, our concentration is only at 3,000 milligrams per cubic meter, and this is a run without any primary producers turned on. So when we turn them on, then we'll see some of these nutrients move through the system, go into the detrital pool, and kind of sink out of Atlantis. We also saw a great improvement in that second box, that Detroit River box, where the water flow into that box is a lot higher. The nutrient concentration is very high as well. But this means that in our second box, we really see nice annual trends in the nutrient concentrations. So when we were able to get our phosphorus values into a more accurate range, I was able to calibrate the primary producer growth so that it was actually responding to the phosphorus. Unfortunately, when my organisms started uptaking the phosphorus, they would then die because phosphorus was depleted from the system, and after primary producer death, we didn't see the phosphorus return to our system. And since I had said primary producers can only grow if there's phosphorus, we would then see the next 10 years of the model run have no more primary producer growth. So we needed to keep this phosphorus cycle in because, as I mentioned, and as you can see here in this image, the phosphorus influx is really important to that Western Basin hydrodynamic flow and the Western Basin nutrient levels, so we needed to find a way to actually make this phosphorus cycle work. Within the code of Atlantis, originally there was no phosphorus component, but the developers added a phosphorus cycle specifically for our lake models, and the phosphorus cycling hadn't really been fully fleshed out yet. So as we looked to the code, we saw a number of different unit conversion errors and small little things where they were getting divided by a number when no division was necessary. So we took out these small typos, and when we did that, we did see some phosphorus return to that system, but it was really clear we were still missing that complete phosphorus recycling link. Because there wasn't enough time within my project to fully redo this section of the code, we decided to basically swap the labels of nitrogen and phosphorus in the Atlantis system. So we force in what we call phosphorus, but we tell Atlantis to think of it as nitrogen and to think of basically the scale of our phosphorus, but consider it nitrogen. So this works somewhat well, and it allows us to get the overall trends, but unfortunately nitrogen cycles through Atlantis fairly specifically with nitrification and denitrification principles. So in the long run, we will need to figure out a way to properly represent the phosphorus cycle. So that brings me to my next problem. When we open our visualization software for Lake Erie Atlantis, we can see our map, and unfortunately it is on top of Lake Michigan, and that is not where Lake Erie is supposed to be. So this was actually not a problem for our model because Atlantis reads the map as kind of, it just uses the points to visualize it in its own scale, but when we went to take the data from the FVCOM model, it uses that latitude and longitude from our Atlantis shapefile to pull the data. And unfortunately, when our model was in the incorrect zone, we ended up having very incorrect data pulled from the FVCOM model. And so we pulled both temperature and hydrodynamic data. And here you can see in our surface layer of Lake Erie in August, we had about a high temperature of 15 degrees Celsius in the Western Basin. And all of these beige boxes that you see are null values. So Atlantis reads them as 0 degrees Celsius. And obviously that's not representative of Lake Erie in August. So we had to fix our shapefile, put it into the proper UTM zone and the proper latitude longitude units so that we could properly pull the values from the FVCOM model. When we did this, we see a lot better temperature distribution. That top left box is still that first layer, and it's about 25 degrees on the surface now in August. And as you can see, going left to right and down throughout our different layers, as you gradually go down, you decrease in temperature, and then the final box is that sediment layer. So updating our map file allowed us to have better temperature data and better hydrodynamic data. So once I was able to work through these main roadblocks, I was able to do some calibration for the primary producer growth. Although a lot of values had been initialized in Atlantis prior to my fellowship, the values of primary producer nutrient uptake and primary producer growth had not been specifically put in for our lake model. So I went and I found all these values from different historical models, and I put in specific ranges, calibrated their nutrient uptake within these acceptable ranges, and then scaled their growth rate until it was what we would expect to see in Lake Erie in the Western Basin. So I was able to get my results so that we have about 10 milligrams of nitrogen in our blue-green algae per cubic meter, and it peaks about once a year as we would expect, which is really thanks to that temperature file. Although this specific run didn't have an updated phosphorus value, when we now put in that correct phosphorus forcing file, it's going to be a lot easier because we've already scaled our growth. So our primary producers will be able to properly respond to our updated nutrient values. So that brings me to the future steps of the Lake Erie Atlantis model. And there's a newer version of the code available. So if we can convert our model to the newer code, we'll be able to work through some more fine-tuned problems that we find with Atlantis. We also need to do more work with that phosphorus cycle, so completing that loop so we can really properly represent a lake ecosystem. And then calibration, further calibration of the primary producers and of course those higher trophic levels, and then actually implementing the model so we can use it for those management decisions. And that brings me to my acknowledgments. I'm really thankful for my mentor, Hongyan. She was very helpful in figuring out a very complex ecosystem model, as well as my help from Ed and Doran. And CIGLR was responsible for writing the script for the FVCOM transfer, which was really helpful and really great to get that updated hydrodynamics file.
Back to the slide that shows the inputs to the lake, that nice image that shows the watersheds. Yep, that one right there. Yep. So my primary question is what exactly are those orange lines showing? They seem to be scaled and proportional to something, and I'm not sure if it's concentration or load or...
Yeah, so those are showing the phosphorus load. So you can see in the bottom left, that's the Maumee, where we get about 46% of the phosphorus load. And then the upper left is the Detroit River, where we have about 40% of the total load. So
Okay.
It's the load.
And do you have a feel for where, I can't read sort of on the legend, I'm sure it's there, but who generated this map, and do you know where that data came from by any chance?
It's very small, but I can send you that later.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
U of M?
Yeah.
Okay.
Open hour.
Oh, open hour. Okay. I'm very interested in finding out more about sort of the Detroit River and the impacts of its flow and the concentration of loads on Lake Erie. So I love that image. Thanks for showing that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Rae.